Do you know what the theoretical foundation for much biblical scholarship rests upon? Well, you're about to find out. We're going to talk about the book of Daniel, the book of Isaiah, and the Pentateuch, and we're going to look at some of the scholarship that's come in the last couple of hundred years that has pointed to different dating of those books. And we're going to see what the underlying bias is across all of this scholarship. And we're also going to go back into these books and get exact quotations from these people admitting this particular bias. Stay tuned. This is S.J. Thomason with Truth Matters at Christian-apologist.com. I teach an executive DBA course on research methods that my class studies the structure and components of academic journal articles and the theoretical foundations of the hypotheses proposed on those articles. I have a PhD in business administration with specializations in international management and human resource management. But I also like to read the Bible and biblical scholarship because I love the Bible and I'm a Christian and I find it very interesting. When assessing the theoretical foundations, it's important to identify any assumptions or biases the authors may hold. In the course of my own studies of Western biblical scholarship over the past few centuries, I have uncovered a bias that forms the undercurrent of almost all critical analyses of the Pentateuch, the book of Isaiah, and the book of Daniel. Namely, the proponents of hypotheses that date these books much later than traditionally believed do so due to their assumptions that predictive prophecies are not possible. Therefore, the authors must have written the books during or after the time periods in which the prophecies came true. While some scholars today may want to deny this, the earliest advocates of the documentary hypothesis on the Pentateuch, Deutero Isaiah on the book of Isaiah, and the Maccabean Thesis on Daniel didn't hide their assumptions, as we'll soon find. The sad thing is so many scholars today don't state their biases against prophecies. Rather, they assume the hypotheses on this dating, the later dating, have been supported, so they have no need for further investigation. That is sloppy scholarship, any way you look at it. So we'll first look at the Pentateuch and Julius Wellhausen. We're going to look, he lived between 1844 and 1918. And he had a lot against 2 Kings 22 because he saw the prophecies therein. Here is what he said in his book. Quote, "The assumptions I will make find an ever-recurring justification in the course of the investigation. The two principles are that the work of the Jehovist, as far as the nucleus of it is concerned, belongs to the course of the Assyrian period, and that Deuteronomy belongs to its close. Moreover, however strongly I am convinced that the latter is to be dated in accordance with 2 Kings 22. I do not, like Graff, so use this position to make it the fulcrum for my lever. Deuteronomy is the starting point, not in the sense that without it would be impossible to accomplish anything, but only because when its position has been historically ascertained, we cannot decline to go on, but must demand that the position of the priestly code should be fixed by reference to history." You're seeing what's going on here. He is saying that there's no way that there could be a fulfilled prophecy. Therefore, the prophecy which occurred hundreds of years before the Assyrian exile in 2 Kings 22 must have actually been written during the exile. It's a bias, and it forms the foundation of his theory. Here is what 2 Kings 22 says. "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, tell the man who sent you to me, thus says the Lord, behold, I will bring disaster upon this place and upon its inhabitants, all the words of the book that the king of Judah has read, because they have forsaken me and have made me offerings to other gods, that they might provoke me to anger with all the work of their hands. Therefore my wrath will be kindled against this place, and it will not be quenched." So you see that sort of thing. He's predicting what happened under the Assyrian exile when the northern tribes of Israel were conquered and taken over by Assyria. This occurred around the 8th century before Christ. Wellhausen bases his hypotheses on the assumption that predictive prophecies cannot exist because that would imply divine inspiration of the text. Rather, he proposes multiple authors of the Pentateuch who wrote during or after the period in which they prophesied. This pattern is repeated again and again and again by biblical scholars all the way from the 18th century, 19th century to today. Wellhausen writes of the way he arrived at his hypothesis, quote, "At last, in the course of a casual visit in Göttingen in the summer of 1867, I learned through ritual through Karl Heinrich Graf, placed the law later than the prophets. And almost without knowing his reasons for the hypothesis, I was prepared to accept it. I readily acknowledged to myself the possibility of understanding Hebrew antiquity without the book of the Torah. You see what he did? You see what he did? So slimy. Yes. So let's now turn, and we have our quotation right here. So let's now turn over to the next bit of writing. Ulrich Burgess, in a scholarly article about Deutero Isaiah, he's a current scholar, wrote this: the historical gap of more than 150 years, which lies between Isaiah and the end of the 8th century and the time of the exilic period, presumed in Isaiah 40 to 55, or Cyrus's decree in 539, could, with the rise of historical critical biblical interpretation, no longer be overcome by referring to the visionary power of Isaiah, end quote. Let's again look at the timeline. So Israel, the northern tribes, had been taken over under the Assyrian Empire right around 722 BC. That's when Isaiah wrote the book of Isaiah, the entire book of Isaiah at that time. Now, over 100 years later, we have the Babylonian Empire. So right around 609 to 605, we've got Babylon taking over the southern tribes of Israel. And at 586 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon destroyed the temple, destroyed the Jewish temple, the synagogue, the first temple. And it was rebuilt 70 years later. It was completed in 516. In 539 BC, we have the rise of the Medo-Persian kingdom, and King Cyrus, along with Darius the Mede, took over the Babylonian kingdom and freed the Jewish peoples who were in exile under that. Again, 539. So 70 years after the first fight to take over Israel from the northern, from the Babylonian kingdom, which was predicted, of course, by Jeremiah. And also what we have with King Cyrus is he took over and he issued a call to rebuild the temple, and the temple was completed in 516. So that is something that's going on there. And then, as you probably know from the book of Daniel, Daniel 9, 24 to 27, there were 77s less 7 of years that passed after the call to rebuild Jerusalem. Now, those calls occurred around 457 to 444 BC, and that gives us a window of time for when Daniel said the anointed one was going to be cut off. Well, we have 483 years after that, brings us right around the window of the year 33 AD, when Jesus, the anointed one, was crucified and he resurrected. So let's go back to see what else Ulrich Burgess says. To compound matters, Isaiah is said not only to have announced the prospect of salvation, but also to have mentioned the name of the new Persian ruler, Cyrus II, who reigned between 559 and 530 in Isaiah 44:28 and 45:1. It was this problem which gave rise toward the end of the 18th century to the argument between ecclesiastical and rationalistic interpretation. This argument was not only concerned with the question as to which words can be traced back to Isaiah, but more fundamentally with the question as to what rationally comprehensible accreditation one was prepared to give to the prophets and what not. This is of utmost importance to the emergence of the Deutero Isaiah Hypothesis. Johann Christoph Dauderlein, who lived between 1746 and 1792, professor at the Franconian University of Altdorf, writes, quote, "The dogmatics of Christians cannot be the dogmatics of the contemporaries of Isaiah. And where Cyrus is being described, I cannot think of the Messiah." He then poses the question, might it not be feasible that this entire chapter was only written down during the Babylonian exile? Only as late as 1789 does Dauderlein formulate the thesis in the 3rd edition of his Isaiah commentary that the oratio, or rather the entire book after chapter 40, cannot be attributed to Isaiah, but that it is written at the end of the exilic period by an anonymous, or rather homonymous, prophet. Okay, so you can see the problem. What does Isaiah 44:28 says? Well, Isaiah, again, writing around 722 BC, prophesied Cyrus, who began his reign in 539. Here's what it says. Who says of Cyrus, he shall be my shepherd, and he shall fulfill my purpose, saying of Jerusalem, she shall be built, and of the temple, your foundation shall be laid. Now let's recall, Cyrus issued a call to rebuild the temple, and it was completed, the second temple was completed in 516 BC. Isaiah 45, 1-3 says, "Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped, to subdue nations before him and to loose the belts of kings, to open doors before him, that gates may not be closed. I will go before you and level the exalted places. I will break in pieces the doors of bronze and cut through the bars of iron. I will give you the treasures of darkness and the hoards in secret places, that you may know that it is I, the Lord, the God of Israel, who call you by your name." Okay. So then we have other scholars. Johann Gottfried Eichhorn in 1752, lived between 1752 and 1827, grabbed Doderlein's baton and circled the track in his book, Introduction in the Old Testament in 1783, which, quote, enjoyed an unusually broad distribution outside of the circle of professional biblical scholars. From his book and others in the 1800s, the proposition developed among scholars that assumed a later exilic composition of Isaiah 40-66. Okay, and others followed him, like Bernard Doom. Now let's look at the book of Daniel and the biases that rest in this book as well. And you can see here pictured S.R. Driver. Okay, so let's take a look. Now, Daniel, of course, also predicted the four kingdoms. He was living during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BC. And he predicted that the Medo-Persian kingdom would follow, which it did. He also predicted that the Greek kingdom, he named it even, the Greek kingdom would follow that. And of course, that occurred right around 322 BC under King Alexander the Great. And then he predicted that the fourth and final empire, out of that would come the king who would rule forever. And of course, that's the Roman Empire. And of course, it's King Jesus. So let's look at the Maccabean Thesis. For centuries, the earlier dating of Daniel was considered a given, this 6th century BC. The only ancient claimant of the hypotheses that it was written around 165 BC is Porphyry around 285 AD, who wrote a book called Against the Christians, which was burned by the church in 448 AD. St. Jerome, Eusebius, Methodius, and others condemned Porphyry's allegations, which died down after that, only to be resurrected by scholars over the past couple of centuries. In his book, Porphyry put forth the notion that Daniel was written no earlier than 165, based on Daniel 8 and Daniel 11, which he believed was a prophecy about Antiochus Epiphanes IV. Between September of 171 BC and December of 165 BC, Antiochus Epiphanes desecrated the temple by sacrificing swine and severely persecuting Jews, just as portended over a 2,300-day time period in Daniel 8:13-14. Such a specific prophecy led Porphyry to determine that Daniel must have written the book in hindsight, not in advance. So scholars have resurrected this notion. S.R. Driver, who lived between 1846 and 1914, said this, "And there are certainly grounds which, though they may not be regarded as demonstrative, except on the part of those who deny all predictive prophecy, nonetheless make the opinion a highly probable one, that the book is the work of the age of Antiochus Epiphanes. The minuteness of the predictions, embracing even special events in the distant future, is also out of harmony with the analogy of prophecy. Isaiah, Jeremiah, and other prophets unquestionably uttered predictions of the future, but their predictions, when definite, relate to events of the proximate future only. When, as in the case of Jeremiah's prediction of 70 years of Babylonian supremacy, they concern a more distant future, they are general and indefinite in their terms. And while down to the period of Antiochus's persecution, the actual events are described with surprising distinctness. These facts would imply that the author wrote during the period of Antiochus's persecution itself. As a matter of fact, this supposition explains consistently all of the features of the book. You see what he's doing there? He has a presupposition. He says it's a supposition. He is supposing that the book was written during the prophecy time. So what did Daniel 11? Go ahead and read this, 31-45. He was describing Antiochus Epiphanes. And here's what he says. "And the king shall do as he wills. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak astonishing things against the God of gods. He shall prosper till the indignation is accomplished, for what is decreed shall be done. He shall pay no attention to the gods of his fathers, or to the one beloved by women. He shall not pay attention to any other god, for he shall magnify himself above all. He shall honor the God of fortresses instead of these. Okay, so you can see what happened there. And then it says, he shall make them rulers over many and shall divide the land for a price. Now here's what else it says. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall become ruler of the treasures of gold and silver and all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Cushites shall follow in his train. But news from the east and the north shall alarm him, and he shall go out and with great fury to destroy and devote many to destruction. And he shall pitch his palatial tents between the sea and the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end with none to help him. That's Daniel saying this. Now let's see what happened. Antiochus named himself Epiphanes as if he were a glorious manifestation of a god. 2 Maccabees 9:5-12 was actually written during the Maccabean revolt, the Maccabean period in the 2nd century BC. And they reported his demise. Here's what it says. But the all-seeing God, the God of Israel, struck him an incurable and unseen blow. As soon as he ceased speaking, he was seized with a pain in his bowels for which there was no relief, and with sharp internal tortures, and that very justly, for he had tortured the bowels of others with many and strange afflictions. Yet he did not in any way stop his insolence, but was even more filled with arrogance, breathing fire in his rage against the Jews, and giving orders to hasten the journey. And so it came about that he fell out of his chariot as it was rushing along, and the fall was so hard as to torture every limb of his body. Thus he, who had been thinking that he could command the waves of the sea in his superhuman arrogance, and imagining that he could weigh the high mountains in a balance, was brought down to earth and carried in a litter, making the power of God manifest to all. And so the ungodly man's body swarmed with worms, and while he was still living in anguish and pain, his flesh rotted away. And because of his stench, the whole army felt revulsion at his decay. Because of his intolerable stench, no one was able to carry the man who a little while before had thought that he could touch the stars of heaven. Then it was that, broken in spirit, he began to lose much of his arrogance and come to his senses under the scourge of God, for he was tortured with pain every moment. And when he could not endure his own stench, he uttered these words, "It is right to be subject to God, and no mortal should think that he is equal to God." What a perfect lesson for the day. Thank you so much for coming in here. I hope if you like this kind of content, you'll like, subscribe, and do come again. And just remember, whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. Thank you.